In the criminal underworld, violence and murder are at the crux of power wielded by organized crime. These criminal organizations have multiple members who are willing and able to commit murder whenever it is deemed necessary. However, there are some men who become so skilled at the job of murder that their crimes become legendary. These killers are calculating, prolific, efficient, and know how to send a message. These killers are organized crime's top hitmen. Number 7. Roy DeMeo. Part 2. Some victims were killed in other ways for varying reasons. At times, suspected informants are those who committed an act of disrespect against a member of the crew or their superiors, had their bodies left in the streets of New York to serve as a message and a warning. There were also occasions where it would not be possible to lure the intended victim into the Gemini Lounge, in which case, other locations would have to be used. A cabin cruiser owned by Richard DeMeo was used on at least one occasion to dispose of remains. DeMeo's sources of income, as well as his crews, continued to grow. By July of 1976, DeMeo had added an automobile firm by the name of Team Auto Wholesalers to his loan shark customer list. The owner of Team Auto, Matthew Rega, also purchased stolen vehicles from the crew and sold them off at a New Jersey car lot that he owned. Roy would also involve himself with hijacking delivery trucks from John F. Kennedy International Airport. His crew now included Edward Danny Grillo, a hijacker who had just been released from prison. Roy would further integrate himself to his mentor Nino Gaggi by traveling with him to Florida to murder George Byram, the man who supervised the electrical work on Gaggi's summer home and tipped off thieves who would break in and pistol whip Gaggi while robbing him. The 42-year-old Byram was shot in the face and stabbed 11 times. In the fall of 1976, the Gambino family went through a massive change when its boss, Carlo Gambino, died of natural causes. Paul Castellano was named the boss, with Anello Della Croce retaining the position of underboss. The implications of this were twofold for DeMeo. Gaggi was elevated to the position of capo regime, taking over the crew of men Castellano previously headed. This promotion was beneficial for DeMeo, whose mentor was now even closer to the family leadership. Another advantage was that the books would be opened, allowing the New York families to initiate new members into the mafia. Castellano, however, did not immediately open the books for new members in the Gambino family, opting instead to promote existing members and shuffle around the crew's leaders. He also allegedly opposed the idea of DeMeo being made. Castellano involved himself in white-collar crime and looked down on the street-level members such as DeMeo. Additionally, Castellano felt DeMeo was uncontrollable. Gaggi's attempts at persuading Castellano to make DeMeo were continually rejected. By 1977, DeMeo became distraught by this situation and searched for opportunities that would ensure larger returns for his superiors. DeMeo would finally secure his induction into the Gambino family by forming an alliance with an Irish-American gang known as the Westies. The leader of this rival Irish gang, Mickey Spillane, was causing delays for the construction of the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, much to the frustration of Gambino boss Paul Castellano, who had a part in the project. Roy DeMeo set up a meeting with a young Westies member named James Coonan through DeMeo crew member Danny Grillo. Coonan hated Spillane because years earlier Spillane had slapped around his father. Coonan also wanted control of the Westies and agreed to ally the gang with the Gambino family should he be in control. On May 13, 1977, DeMeo and Danny Grillo would murder Spillane. Coonan and Grillo would then murder Major West Side loan shark Ruby Stein, solidifying Coonan's place atop the Westies. Shortly afterward, Coonan and his second-in-command, Mickey Featherstone, were called to a meeting with Castellano in which they agreed to become a de facto arm of the Gambino family and share 10% of all profits. In exchange, the Westies would be privy to several lucrative union deals and take on murder contracts for the family. It was DeMeo's pivotal role in the Westie-Gambino alliance that reportedly convinced Castellano to give DeMeo his button and formally induct him into the Gambino family. DeMeo was made in mid-1977 and put in charge of handling all family business with the Westies. As a made man, Roy was ordered to get permission before committing any more murders and to avoid drug dealing. DeMeo's crew, however, continued to sell large amounts of cocaine, marijuana, and a variety of narcotic pills. As a made man, DeMeo would find himself in trouble right out of the gate. In 1977, Jonathan Quinn, who was a car thief working with DeMeo and Gaggi, was suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. Quinn was lured to a sit-down and killed. Quinn's 19-year-old girlfriend, Sherry Golden, was also murdered. Quinn was found in a desolate area of Staten Island, and Golden was found in an abandoned car 4 days later. The murder made the papers, and it was rumored that Castellano, after reading the story, questioned Nino Gaggi about Golden's murder. It is alleged that Gaggi lied to Castellano about Golden being an informant to save DeMeo's life. Many speculate that DeMeo was never in serious danger due to his capacity as an earner and his importance as muscle for Castellano. As DeMeo and his crew became increasingly violent, people that they suspected of talking to law enforcement began to disappear in greater numbers. In late 1977, 28-year-old Daniel Conti and John Costello were shot and killed by DeMeo and Conti's brother-in-law Peter LaFroscia. LaFroscia was also involved in the Quinn killing. DeMeo was concerned that Conti and Costello would cooperate in an investigation being opened by detectives into a failed hijacking attempt involving the DeMeo crew. DeMeo would tie up a few more loose ends when on March 19, 1978, Michael Mandolino and Nino Martini were both shot multiple times in the head by the DeMeo crew. 37-year-old Mandolino was accused of setting up Peter LaFroscia for robbery. However, the 38-year-old Martini was simply an innocent bystander and considered collateral damage by the crew. By this time, DeMeo was becoming more brazen and out of control. On March 23, 1978, Patrick Prisenzano, a 31-year-old Bonanno associate and son of Bonanno family capo, Angelo Prisenzano, was beaten and shot before getting his throat slit from ear to ear by Roy DeMeo in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. The younger Prisenzano met his demise for refusing to return stolen jewelry to an associate of DeMeo's. Then on May 16, 1978, DeMeo would hand out vigilante justice when Lucchese associate Michael DiCarlo was murdered for raping a young boy. DiCarlo was shot, stabbed, beaten, and sodomized by DeMeo, Joseph Guglielmo, Danny Grillo, Henry Borelli, Anthony Senner, and Joseph Testa. His body was dismembered using the Gemini method, leaving no trace of the victim. Roy DeMeo was not above handing out discipline, even to his own crew. On November 17, 1978, he, Chris Rosenberg, Anthony Center, and Joseph Testa would murder fellow crew member Danny Grillo. Grillo had fallen into heavy debt with DeMeo, and the crew feared that he was susceptible to police coercion. Grillo, who was dismembered and disposed of like many of the crew's murder victims, was the first known occurrence of internal discipline within the DeMeo crew. Then on February 7, 1979, 30-year-old cocaine dealer Peter Waring was shot, stabbed, and dismembered by DeMeo, Henry Borelli, and Paul Dordal at the Gemini Lounge for being a suspected informant. Later that same month, it was rumored that DeMeo would play the role of vigilante again when the family of a rape victim hired the DeMeo crew to murder the suspect, Scott Cafaro. Cafaro was shot multiple times. Then on February 19, 1979, 60-year-old Fred Todaro was shot by Roy DeMeo and stabbed by Chris Rosenberg after his nephew hired the DeMeo crew to murder Todaro due to a dispute over the building in which they duplicated pornographic films. Soon detectives would begin connecting the dots from these murders to DeMeo, causing increasing heat from law enforcement. Things were about to get a lot tougher for Roy and his crew. Soon Roy would be forced to kill another one of his own men. This time, sadly for him, it was a young man he thought of as a son. Chris Rosenberg had set up a drug deal with a Cuban man living in Florida, and then murdered him and his associates when they traveled to New York to complete the sale. The Cuban had connections with major Cuban drug gangs in Miami, raising the possibility of violence between the Gambino family and the Cubans unless Rosenberg was dealt with. In order to avoid a war with the Cubans, Paul Castellano ordered DeMeo to kill Rosenberg. DeMeo, trying to find a way to save his friend, stalled for weeks. During this period, DeMeo was extremely paranoid and because of that would make one of his first big mistakes. This mistake would be the murder of Dominic Ragucci. Ragucci was a college student with no criminal ties who was paying for his tuition as a door-to-door salesman. DeMeo saw Ragucci parked outside his Massapequa Park home and assumed that he was a Cuban assassin. DeMeo and crew members Joseph Guglielmo and Freddie DeNome pursued Ragucci in a 7-mile car chase on Route 110 through Amityville and Farmingdale, after which the student was shot to death by DeMeo. After returning home and gathering his family, DeMeo drove them out to Long Island and left them at a hotel in upstate New York for 2 weeks. According to DeMeo's son Albert, he started crying when he discovered that he had murdered an innocent teenager and did not eat for several days. The public execution of Ragucci also put a strain on DeMeo's relationship with his wife Gladys, who had previously been able to ignore her husband's criminal activities. Gaggi was infuriated by the murder of Ragucci and ordered DeMeo to kill Rosenberg before there were any other innocent victims. Backed into a corner, DeMeo had no choice but to kill his friend. On May 11, 1979, Rosenberg reported to the Gemini Clubhouse for the crew's usual Friday night meeting. Shortly after his arrival, DeMeo quickly fired a single bullet into the unsuspecting Rosenberg's head. The usually ice-cold DeMeo hesitated when the still-living Rosenberg managed to rise off the floor to one knee. However, Anthony Center then moved in and finished him off with 4 shots to the head. Unlike Grillo, Rosenberg's body was not dismembered or made to disappear. The Cubans had demanded that his murder make the newspapers. DeMeo's men placed Rosenberg's body in his car and left it on the side of Cross Bay Boulevard near the Gateway National Wildlife Refuge in Broad Channel, Queens. Albert DeMeo later recounted that Rosenberg's murder affected his father deeply and that when DeMeo came home after the killing, he went into his study room and didn't come out for 2 days. After Rosenberg's murder, DeMeo spent 6 weeks hiding out with Guglielmo in a safe house near 42nd Street in Times Square, Manhattan, growing a full beard and disguising himself with a baseball cap and sunglasses when out in public. Despite popping up on the radar of multiple law enforcement agencies, DeMeo continued to develop new rackets which made the Gambino family millions of dollars in the process. As 1979 continued, DeMeo began to expand his business activities, in particular his auto theft operation, which soon became the largest in New York City's history. Dubbed the Empire Boulevard operation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the operation consisted of hundreds of stolen cars being shipped from the port of Newark, New Jersey, to Kuwait and Puerto Rico. DeMeo put together a group of 5 active partners in the operation, all of whom earned approximately $30,000 a week each in profit. Aside from stolen automobiles, DeMeo was also shipping cigarettes and pornographic magazines to the Middle East. DeMeo had a separate crew of thieves whose job it was to steal the cars. Among these associates was Vito Arena, a longtime car thief and armed robber who began working for DeMeo in 1978 after murdering his old partner. Like Freddie DeNome, Arena became closely involved with the DeMeo crew by the end of the 1970s. That same year, old-time Gambino soldier James Eppolito Sr. met with Paul Castellano and accused DeMeo and Gaggi of drug dealing, which under Cosa Nostra rules carries the penalty of death. Castellano, to whom Gaggi was a close ally, sided against Eppolito in the situation. This was most likely due to the large amounts of drug money Castellano received from the DeMeo crew, and thus gave Gaggi permission to do what he pleased. Gaggi and DeMeo shot Ippolito Sr. and his son, James Ippolito Jr., to death in Ippolito Jr.'s car en route to the Gemini Club on October 1st, 1979. A witness driving by right as shots were fired within the parked car managed to alert a nearby police officer, who later arrested Gaggi after a shootout between the two that left Gaggi with a bullet wound in his neck. Since DeMeo had split up with Gaggi as they left the scene, he was not arrested or identified by the witness. Gaggi was charged with murder and the attempted murder of a police officer, but through jury tampering was convicted of only assault and given a 5 to 15-year sentence in federal prison. DeMeo would murder the witness shortly after Gaggi's sentencing in March of 1980. DeMeo's stolen car racket, which was dubbed the Empire Boulevard operation, continued to expand through 1979 until the warehouse serving as its headquarters was raided by agents from the Newark branch of the FBI in the summer of 1980. The FBI had the warehouse under surveillance for some time and eventually obtained a search warrant for the premises. Henry Borelli and Frederick DeNome were arrested in May of 1981 for their roles in the operation, but there was not enough evidence to arrest any of the other active partners. DeMeo ordered Borelli and DeNome to plead guilty to the charges in hopes that it would stop any further investigation into his activities by the FBI or other law enforcement agencies. By 1982, the FBI was investigating the enormous number of missing and murdered persons who were linked to DeMeo or who had last been seen entering the Gemini Lounge. Meanwhile, his boss, Paul Castellano, was under tremendous heat after being linked to DeMeo's stolen car racket. Castellano was also losing patience with DeMeo's reckless off-the-record murders. Feeling like DeMeo was out of control and afraid that he might decide to cooperate if arrested, Paul Castellano decided that DeMeo had to go. Around this time, an FBI bug in the home of Gambino family soldier Angelo Ruggiero picked up a conversation between Ruggiero and Gene Gotti, brother of Gambino capo John Gotti. During the conversation, Ruggiero and Gotti discussed how Paul Castellano had put out a hit on DeMeo but was having difficulty finding someone willing to do the job. Gene Gotti would go on to mention that his brother John was wary of taking the contract because DeMeo had an army of killers around him. During that same conversation, it is also mentioned that Gotti had been involved in fewer than 10 murders, while DeMeo himself had killed 37, and that was only the ones they knew about. According to mob turncoat Sammy the Bull Gravano, eventually the contract was given to Frank DeCicco, but DeCicco and his crew could not get to DeMeo either. DeCicco allegedly handed the job to DeMeo's own men. In the biography of Anthony Casso, aptly named Gaspipe, Confessions of a Mafia Boss, Anthony Gaspipe Casso corroborated that Castellano had ordered John Gotti and Frank DeCicco to kill DeMeo, and that neither of them were able to get close enough to do the job. It is then alleged that DeCicco suggested that Gaspipe handle the hit. Casso would then use DeMeo's own men to carry it out. He knew Anthony Center and Joseph Testa well. Casso ordered them to kill DeMeo, assuring them that there would be no retribution and that afterwards they would be joining him in the Lucchese crime family. DeMeo's son Albert wrote that in his final days, Roy DeMeo was paranoid and believed that he would be killed soon. In his final days, DeMeo considered faking his own death by having his son shoot him and laying low. Finally, on January 10, 1983, DeMeo went to crew member Patty Testa's house for a meeting with his men. The purpose of the meeting was for DeMeo to collect some money he was owed by Patty Testa. Joey Testa and Anthony Center were both there, and as DeMeo sat down and waited for coffee, they shot him dead. That night, he failed to attend his daughter Dion's birthday party, which caused his family to be suspicious. Albert DeMeo later found Roy's personal belongings, such as his watch, wallet, and ring in his study room, as well as a Catholic pamphlet. 10 days later, on January 20th, 1983, DeMeo's Cadillac Coupe de Ville was discovered in the parking lot of the Varuna Boat Club in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. The car was towed to a nearby police station where it was searched by Organized Crime Control Bureau detectives. DeMeo's partially frozen body was found in the trunk with a chandelier on top of it. He had been shot multiple times in the head and had a bullet wound in his hand, assumed by law enforcement to be a reflexive defensive wound caused when his killers opened fire on him. The task force investigating the DeMeo crew theorized that DeMeo was set up in a similar manner to how he set up Rosenberg, and that Gaggi, Testa, and Center were present when he was killed. In April 1984, Colombo crime family soldier Ralph Scopo was overheard explaining to an associate that DeMeo had been killed by his own family because they merely suspected that he would not be able to stand up to legal charges that resulted from his stolen car ring. According to Scopo, Castellano said they had to put DeMeo away because he was crazy and had cast iron balls. Ironically, according to Castellano ordering DeMeo's execution actually sealed his own fate, as Gotti and DeCicco were already plotting to kill Castellano and would do so on December 16, 1985. Casso claimed Gotti and DeCicco would have never dared move against Castellano while DeMeo was still alive. Whether or not this statement is valid is up for debate. What isn't debatable is the fear DeMeo struck into his fellow mobsters. While maintaining the facade of a hard-working business and family man, Roy DeMeo perpetrated a reign of terror that very few can match. He will be remembered as the most brutal, fearsome hitman of his era.